It was a bitterly cold evening in Washington, D.C. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. On the busy sidewalks near the Capitol, people hurried along, their breath visible in the freezing air, their minds preoccupied with the concerns of daily life. But for Raymond Ray Carter, life was different. He wasn't rushing home from work. He had no home to go to. The city was his shelter, the streets his bed. A tattered army jacket, 2 sizes too big, hung from his frail frame. His once black boots had holes in the soles, forcing him to stuff scraps of cardboard inside to keep his feet from freezing. Ray had seen better days. Decades ago, he was a construction worker, building homes for people who now wouldn't even meet his eye as they passed. A work accident had shattered his leg, leaving him jobless. Medical bills piled up, debts followed, and soon so did eviction notices. One misfortune after another led him here, to the streets, where he had learned to survive on kindness, if there was any left in the world. That evening, Ray sat on a worn-out blanket near Union Station, a small cardboard sign resting beside him. A little kindness goes a long way. Anything helps. His hands were trembling from the cold as he clutched an empty coffee cup, hoping for some spare change from strangers. As people walked by, he whispered a few words to those who made eye contact. "Can you spare $1?" Most ignored him. Some gave a polite nod and kept walking. A few muttered, "Sorry, man." Ray sighed. He had seen the worst of humanity in these streets, but he had also seen glimpses of kindness. He just had to keep asking. Then, in the midst of the bustling crowd, a man stepped out of a black SUV and walked toward the station. He looked familiar. Ray squinted against the streetlights, his breath hitching in his throat. It was JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States. Ray wasn't a political man. He barely kept up with the news. But even he knew the face of the second most powerful man in the country. As JD Vance walked past, Ray felt a sudden urge, a moment of reckless courage. His voice cracked as he called out, "Sir, can you give me $1?" JD Vance stopped. His head turned slightly, as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Then slowly he faced Ray. The world around them didn't seem to notice the moment unfolding. Pedestrians continued their march, oblivious. But for Ray, time slowed as he met the vice president's piercing blue eyes. JD took a step forward, then another. Ray braced himself. He had seen powerful men before. They either ignored him or gave a fake smile and walked away. He expected the same from the vice president. But JD Vance did something unexpected. Something that made Ray's heart pound. He reached into his pocket, but not for $1. Ray's breath hitched as JD Vance reached into his pocket. His heart pounded in anticipation. Would the vice president pull out $1? A 20? Maybe he'd just walk away, leaving Ray to stew in his own foolish hope. But what JD pulled out was neither money nor his phone. It was his wallet. The vice president opened it, glanced at something inside, then looked up at Ray. His expression wasn't one of pity or dismissal. It was something else, something deeper. "Tell me something," JD said, his voice calm but firm. "What would you do with this $1?" Ray blinked, confused. Nobody had ever asked him that before. He stammered. "I was just hoping to get something warm to eat. Maybe a cup of coffee." JD studied him. The man's gaze wasn't condescending, but it was searching, as if he was trying to read the life story written in the lines on Ray's face. Then JD Vance did something no one expected. He took out a crisp $100 bill and held it up between his fingers. Ray's eyes widened. $100? That was more than he'd seen in weeks. His fingers twitched, tempted to reach for it, but something about the vice president's intense gaze held him back. "Here's $100, JD said. "But it comes with one condition." Ray swallowed hard. He had heard of people pulling tricks on the homeless before. Were there cameras somewhere? Was this a social experiment? What condition? Ray asked warily. JD tucked the bill back into his wallet. "I'll give you this money if you sit with me for 10 minutes and answer a few questions." Ray hesitated. Sounded too easy. Just answer questions? He had begged for food, warmth, dignity, but he had never been offered a conversation. He looked up at JD, trying to gauge if the man was serious. The vice president wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. Ray sighed. His stomach ached from hunger. His fingers were frozen stiff, and his pride was barely intact. What choice did he have? "All right," he muttered. "You got yourself a deal." JD nodded and gestured toward a nearby bench. As they sat, a few passersby stole glances, probably wondering what the vice president was doing talking to a homeless man. But JD ignored them. Then he asked the first question. "How did you get here?" Ray exhaled slowly. He had told his story before, to social workers, to shelter volunteers, even to the occasional kind stranger who bought him a meal. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, someone in power wasn't just looking at him. They were listening, and so he began to speak. Ray hesitated for a moment, then cleared his throat. His voice was hoarse, partly from the cold and partly from years of feeling unheard. "I wasn't always like this," he began, staring at the sidewalk as if searching for pieces of his past among the cracks. "I used to work construction. Good money, too. Built houses, office buildings. Hell, I even worked on a shopping mall once." JD Vance nodded, listening intently. "So what happened?" the vice president asked. Ray sighed. "An accident." He shifted on the bench, wincing as if the memory itself caused him pain. "One of those big scaffolding rigs collapsed. I was on it, fell 20 feet, landed wrong, shattered my leg. Doctors patched me up, but it was never the same. Painkillers helped for a while, until they didn't." JD's expression hardened. He knew where this was going. "You got hooked?" he asked. Ray gave a bitter chuckle. "Didn't mean to. At first, I just needed something to dull the pain. Then I needed something to get me through the day. And before I knew it, I was selling everything I owned just to get another pill." He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them. "I lost my job, lost my apartment, my family." He swallowed hard. "They tried to help, but I was too proud, too stubborn, thought I could fix it myself. Then, when I couldn't, I was too ashamed to ask for help." JD nodded slowly. "And now," Ray exhaled through his nose, "now I live where I can. Shelters, alleys, park benches if the cops don't chase me off. Some days I get a few bucks for food. Some days I don't." He turned to JD, squinting. "But I bet you already knew that part, huh?" JD didn't smile. Instead, he reached into his wallet again, pulling out the same crisp $100 bill. "I don't give handouts, Ray," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I give opportunities." Ray furrowed his brows. "What's that supposed to mean?" JD held up the bill between his fingers. "If I give you this money right now, no strings attached, what will you do with it?" Ray opened his mouth, but JD cut him off. "Be honest." Ray clenched his jaw. He wanted to say he'd buy food, maybe a warm coat, but deep down he knew the temptation was there. He'd spent years numbing his pain with whatever he could afford. What if that temptation won? His silence was answer enough. JD leaned forward. "You're not a bad man, Ray. You're just stuck. But money alone won't fix that. You need something bigger." Ray frowned. "Like what?" JD pulled out a business card and placed it in Ray's hand. "A second chance." Ray looked down. The card was for a rehabilitation program. One that helped homeless veterans and laborers get clean, get jobs, and get their lives back. His throat tightened. Why would you do this for me?" JD's expression softened. "Because I know what it's like to feel stuck, Ray. And because I believe in people, even when they stop believing in themselves." Ray stared at the card, his fingers trembling. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a fantasy. Felt real. Ray sat in stunned silence, the business card feeling heavier in his hand than the $100 bill ever could. He traced his fingers over the embossed letters, reading the name of the rehabilitation program over and over again. He had heard of places like this before. Some were genuine, offering real help. Others were just another dead end. Paperwork, empty promises, and a revolving door that spat men like him back onto the streets. But something about the way JD Vance looked at him made him think this might be different. Still, old habits died hard. Ray let out a short laugh, shaking his head. So that's it, huh? You're just gonna swoop in, hand me a card, and expect me to turn my life around. JD's expression didn't change. No, Ray. I expect you to decide if you're ready to turn your life around. The words hit Ray harder than he expected. He had spent so many years blaming the system, blaming bad luck, blaming his past. But when was the last time he had actually made a choice for himself? One that wasn't just about surviving the next day. He rubbed his tired eyes. And what if I take this money and disappear? What if I don't call that number? JD shrugged. Then that's your choice. I'm not here to save you, Ray. I'm here to remind you that you're still capable of saving yourself. Ray swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. A gust of wind blew through the streets, sending a shiver through his body. He clenched his fists to keep them from shaking, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from the emotions threatening to spill over. JD stood up, adjusting his coat. Listen, he said, his tone gentler now. If you don't believe in second chances, that's fine. But I do. And I think you deserve one. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the $100 bill, and tucked it into Ray's coat pocket. Use it for something that helps you, not hurts you. Ray looked down, his throat tightening. JD turned to walk away, but before he did, he said one last thing. And if you ever doubt yourself, remember this: tonight, the Vice President of the United States stopped what he was doing to listen to you. Because you matter, Ray. You always did. And with that, JD Vance walked back toward his SUV, leaving Ray sitting there. Card in one hand, money in his pocket, and a decision weighing heavier on his soul than anything he had ever faced before. Ray sat on the cold bench, staring at the business card in his trembling hands. The Vice President's words echoed in his mind. You matter, Ray. You always did. For years, he had felt invisible. A ghost walking the streets, passed by 1,000 people a day who never really saw him. But tonight someone had. And not just anyone. The Vice President of the United States. He had no reason to stop. No reason to care. Yet he did. Ray exhaled sharply, his breath forming a mist in the cold air. He looked at the crisp $100 bill tucked into his coat pocket. It was enough for a warm meal, maybe a motel room for the night. He could even buy a bottle to numb the storm of emotions raging inside him. That last thought made him pause. That's what the old Ray would do. The Ray who had given up. But maybe, just maybe, tonight was a sign that he didn't have to be that man anymore. Slowly, he pulled out an old flip phone from his pocket. It barely worked, but he kept it for emergencies, though he had never quite figured out what qualified as an emergency. Maybe this was one. His fingers hovered over the keypad. He could still walk away, spend the $100 however he pleased, and forget this moment ever happened. But wasn't that the problem? He had spent years running. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to fight. Ray swallowed hard. Then, before he could change his mind, he dialed the number on the business card. It rang once, twice. Then, a woman's voice answered. This is Safe Haven Recovery. How can I help you? Ray's mouth went dry. For a moment he almost hung up. But then he saw the image of JD Vance walking away, his words still ringing in his ears. I believe in people, even when they stop believing in themselves. Ray took a deep breath. Hi, my name is Ray, and I think I'm ready to start over. There was silence for a brief moment. Then the woman's voice, calm and warm. That's good to hear, Ray. Let's get you some help. As the call continued, Ray didn't realize it, but for the first time in years he was smiling. Tonight, a homeless man had asked the vice president for a single dollar. But what he had received was worth so much more. He had received hope, and sometimes that was all a man needed to change his life.